Joining me now is Elizabeth Spiers. She's the founder of the Insurrection. She also wrote the article, Beyond Pelosi, Why Impeachment Can't Penetrate the Cult of DC Savvy for the New Republic. Elizabeth, welcome to the Young Turks.
Thank you for having me.
No problem. Look, I'll be honest, loved your article. Loved it.
Thank you.
Because it was riddled with facts, which is usually good for an article, a news article. But let's start with the original premise. So conventional wisdom in Washington is that Nancy Pelosi is a brilliant tactician, and what would the Democratic Party do without her? You seem to have countered that. So what's your take on the veracity of that conventional wisdom?
Well, I mean, the funny thing is that I think, generally speaking, Pelosi is a brilliant tactician, but I think we almost go so far in giving her the benefit of the doubt in that respect that she can say things that are essentially evidenceless, and we go a little bit too far in assuming that she has, evidence to back it up. And as I said in the article, I've seen this before. I was a financial reporter for a long time, and I remember people giving Alan Greenspan the same benefit of the doubt going into the credit crisis. And it wasn't based on some silly notion that he's not intelligent or that he didn't have some grander strategy, but I think there was too little attempt to hold him accountable and really ask for an explicit rationale. And I feel like I'm seeing the same thing with Pelosi when it comes to impeachment.
Yeah, so look, funny enough, as tough as your article was on Pelosi on that issue, I think Pelosi, I'm much tougher on Pelosi. I think Pelosi's not even a good tactician, let alone a brilliant one. I think she couldn't tactician her way out of a wet paper bag. But anyways, get to that in a second.
You're not the first person who's said that to me.
And you said I am or I'm not the first
you're
person?
You're not, no,
okay,
you're not.
Yeah, well, good. I used to be the only person saying it, so I'm glad others are now beginning to say that. In fact, let me ask you about that as a bridge to the impeachment talk.
Sure.
The fact that a lot of people now believe that she's bungled the impeachment situation, has that finally begun to get people to question, wait a minute, were we right all along about how great she is?
Well, I think to some extent that has happened, because what's going to happen is that if impeachment doesn't happen because, among other things, Nancy Pelosi was standing in the way of it, and we have these long-term downstream consequences that we all, I think are absolutely going to be there if no one holds Trump accountable, that's really going to be her legacy. It won't be how smart we thought she was 8 years ago. And I think that's something the party is wrestling with. I hope that she's wrestling with it. And we're watching other people having to sort of step in and take the reins where she's not displaying leadership on this issue.
Okay, again, one last thing before we go to the evidence on impeachment and how she might not be playing that right, to say the least. The other day, Jerry Nadler came out and said, no, what we're doing in the House is an impeachment inquiry. It's official, it's real. But most people didn't believe him. So having studied this, what's your take? Are they doing an impeachment inquiry or aren't they?
In my opinion, it's better than nothing because it could go into an inquiry. It's certainly better than what we've been dealing with for the last few months, which is Democrats sitting on their hands and not doing anything. I hope that that's not the entirety of the strategy, because you don't see the party uniting behind it as if it's an impeachment inquiry. And a big reason why it's so important to go through that process is that the case needs to be made publicly, and people need to understand what's happening. If people get the sense that this is another, behind closed doors discussion, then what's the point? When you hold the president accountable, it can't be through an obscure process that nobody, the general public, isn't party to. So I would vastly prefer that the party get on the same page about what's happening and initiate impeachment proceedings. This seems like a sort of odd hedge, and I certainly prefer it to doing nothing. But it's not. It undermines what would be a legitimate impeachment process in certain ways if it continues to happen as a quiet process that's only happening in committee, and the public doesn't really understand what's going on.
Well, look, Democrats doing nothing is not news, and them thinking it's a brilliant strategy is not news. Them never making their own case is not news. These incompetent, bumbling fools have been doing this for decades on end, if you ask me. But again, now let's get into the heart of the impeachment issue. So Nancy Pelosi makes a number of claims about why you shouldn't pursue impeachment. Let's go through them as best as we can, one by one. She said that it's okay, she doesn't have to because Donald Trump is doing self-impeachment. Elizabeth, does anybody have any idea what she's talking about?
No, I think as soon as that quote came out of her mouth, even people on her team knew that it was ridiculous. There's no such thing as self-impeachment. And if the idea was everything he's doing is so horrible, we don't need impeachment because people see how bad it is. Well, people said that a couple months into the Trump administration, said it can't get any worse. Every week it does get worse. Trump keeps escalating because no one's stopping him. I mean, that's the bottom line. Until people refuse to hold him accountable with the power that Democrats now have in the House, this will continue to happen. If you think you've seen the bottom, you haven't, because there's always going to be somebody in the Trump administration who's going to come up with something that's worse than whatever we've already seen and sink to that level. So it's just a matter of how deep and wide your imagination is if you think it can't get worse.
Well, Elizabeth, by saying in essence that we're never going to impeach him, doesn't that give, especially a dangerous guy like Donald Trump, who is already inclined in this direction, basically a blank check saying, don't worry. I mean, you've already broken at least two very clear laws: obstruction, there's 10 instances of it in the Mueller report, and campaign finance laws, which is a felony that your co-conspirator is in prison for today, right now, your co-conspirator. So like, people forget about that because the Democrats never mention it because they suck at their jobs and they don't know what they're doing. But anyway, like, if you never bring those things up and you give Trump a blank check, isn't it saying to him, you can shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and get away with it?
Yeah, and I actually worry about something that has much longer term ramifications than that. You think about how bad Trump is, and then you consider that in the context of his weaknesses, his political weaknesses, his strategic weaknesses. Then think about what would happen if you give him a free pass, and then we have another president who's like Trump, but let's suggest that he's more intelligent, better informed, a better strategist. We could have a person who's 10 times more dangerous. And if we don't hold Trump accountable, we've set a precedent that there is no bottom. That there's nothing that someone in the Oval Office can do that's so bad that if the political winds are blowing their way, won't be tolerated. And what that means is that every single norm that we have that holds democracy together but isn't technically a law becomes meaningless. And frankly, many of our laws become meaningless. Parts of the Constitution become meaningless. So the destruction to democracy long term is almost a bigger concern to me than whatever happens in the next 18 months with Trump.
Yeah,
because it's the precedent that we're setting.
100%. There's so many things she's gotten wrong that we got to now pick up the speed and getting through all the ridiculous claims. So let's start with the one you just said there, or transition to that. She says, "Well, look, it's bad politics." Well, there's two things wrong with that. Number one, they're stuck in the 90s. We can get to that in a second. But isn't this a problem when you say Mueller says DOJ cannot indict, right or wrong? That is the opinion of the special counsel. So the only basically government organization that could do anything about the president breaking the law is the House of Representatives in putting together impeachment. So in essence, Pelosi's saying, I don't care what the law is. I don't care what my responsibility is as Speaker of the House. I'm just going to play politics. How is that not brazen?
Well, I think it's brazen, but as I mentioned in the article, I also think it's a bad political calculation. I work as a political strategist in my day job, and I just don't see the potential ramifications that she's articulating on the ground. I think there's a lot of fear mongering around what happens if we go through the impeachment process and the Senate fails to convict, which I believe they won't. But in my view, that's not the point of it. So when Pelosi articulates in very vague terms what she thinks the 2020 consequences are, I just don't see the evidence behind it. I don't see any evidence that, for instance, even if Democrats are not wholeheartedly in favor of impeachment, which by the way they are, but even if the whole country isn't wholeheartedly in favor of impeachment, which we've never begun impeachment investigations around a majority sentiment that they should definitely happen. That didn't happen with Nixon, didn't happen with Clinton. So she's sort of manufacturing a scenario that has never existed in history, where you need unanimous sentiment that the president should be impeached before you consider, beginning an impeachment proceeding. And it doesn't have any historical precedent. There's not even any data. If you were going to make the argument that Pelosi and Dem leadership are just being pragmatic, you still have to have some evidence to back that up. You have to make a case that when we get to 2020, there would be some big backlash that would affect, Democratic turnout. It would affect motivation, and it would rally, the Trump base, which I don't buy that either. Right? Family full of Trump voters in Alabama. So I don't see them becoming more politically engaged than they are.
Of course not. Of course not.
Democrats are going after Trump.
It's total excuses. Well, look, Washington's a fact-free zone, and establishment Democrats have their own alternative facts. That's why I was stunned to read your article. Like, this has actual verifiable facts. It's very unlike the rest of the media. So along those lines, they say, well, when the Republicans did an unjust impeachment of Bill Clinton, it wound up hurting them. First of all, you're just comparing all of Donald Trump's crimes to an unjust impeachment, you moron. That is a terrible political strategy and also not true. And second of all, your facts are wrong. Guess who won the presidential election after the Republicans impeached Bill Clinton? Oh, right, the Republicans. I mean, so Elizabeth, this is kind of a funny question, but when you walk around Washington, D.C., or you talk to other reporters, how can they not see how counterfactual every one of these propositions are?
Well, I think there's a weakness both in media and by the way, in political establishment, where people are very reticent or more to the point. They're not really conditioned to think very long term about these things at all. Political consultants are geared to think toward the next cycle as a matter of course. And they have heavy incentive to do that. Journalists do that too. Not intentionally, I don't think, but it's also particularly for political reporters who were in the trenches in the last cycle. It's hard for them not to experience the kind of cognitive bias where everything in this cycle looks like whatever they saw in the last cycle. And some of it's just, there's not a lot of impetus or incentive for people to really look longitudinally at these things and how they happen. I would argue that if we have to compare the current situation to a prior impeachment, Nixon's a better analog. And if you look at support for Nixon's impeachment in the beginning, it was far lower than support for impeaching Trump right now. So if you have to go back and look at precedent, then there is a precedent. And it would seem to indicate that we should begin impeachment proceedings immediately.
This should not be a political calculation. I'm dead set against considering this as a political calculation. But if you were to look at it as a political calculation, the Democrats impeached Nixon. Guess who won the next election? Democrats. So all facts point to impeachment, but Nancy Pelosi likes that donor money. And so look, I can go on and on. She said that if the Senate doesn't convict him, that he can't be prosecuted afterwards. Total lie, not remotely true, a preposterous thing to say. And she implicitly basically is approving of Donald Trump's actions. So I keep wanting to ask you more questions. Ask you this, and does she understand, do the Democratic establishment, do they understand at all that when they don't pursue Donald Trump and Trump says, see, I was exonerated, it looks like the Democrats are agreeing with him?
I think there's a funny level of naivete about it. There's this idea, and we see this even with establishment Democrats who are running for office. When Joe Biden gets up and says, well, things would be different if Trump was out of office. Republicans would start acting in good faith. I don't see any evidence for that being true, and certainly I would imagine that when she has a moment to herself to think, Nancy Pelosi doesn't think that's true. So there's a little bit of cognitive dissonance that's politically advantageous. I said in the column I thought that, and this is speculation on my part, but that part of the reason why Pelosi doesn't want to pursue impeachment is because it shifts risk to the 2020 candidates. It takes some of the pressure off of leadership if things don't go in the right direction. But that's risky in and of itself, especially when you consider the downside of not holding Trump accountable. And there's this sort of weird reticence to not consider even the political cost of doing it. I agree with you. I can make an argument for impeachment entirely, on a moral basis and on a rule of law basis. But I also think that there's a real argument to be made on a political basis. If you're going to be a complete nihilist and solely make this decision based on a political calculation.
Yeah.
I don't find the logic persuasive that this is even a good political decision.
Not remotely, not 1% as usual, bumbling fools. But I got to end on this. Look, your article brought up 2 points that nobody else does. One is this cowardice on the part of Pelosi. You didn't say that, I did. Saying, well, look, if Biden or some other candidate loses, we blame it on them. But if I do impeachment and our candidate loses, then people blame it on me. And so my personal glory will be diminished.
Yeah.
That is so grating on the nerves, and other than cowardice, it shows incredible selfishness, doesn't care about the Democratic Party, doesn't care about this country at all, et cetera. But you also brought up a second point that no one else does. She said it, she said Donald Trump is good for raising money. So she makes more money, and that is her only source of power. It's certainly not brilliance, and certainly not defeating Republicans. I mean, legislatively, she almost never wins. But she has a ton of corrupt money backing her. So she says, hey, look, I can raise more donor money if Trump's in office. Isn't that a huge part of her real motivation as to why she's not doing impeachment?
I think that's a piece of it, but I also think it's not even, I would say it's not even as directly bad faith as that. This is a strategy that has worked for her before, and she can't imagine being successful at it without having that kind of villain on the other side of it. But again, even that doesn't make sense to me on a pragmatic basis. It's not like you can't raise money off of a horrible person in office in the middle of an impeachment proceeding, because this isn't the only election. This isn't the only battle we have to fight. Right now we have a majority in the House and pretty much nowhere else. And Trump is busy packing the judiciary. I mean, there are plenty of fundraising opportunities. So again, if we're just going to even think like nihilists, there's no lack of fundraising opportunities if impeachment proceedings begin. Yeah. So I think of it more as a failure of the imagination in two senses. One is that they really can't conceive of the long run consequences of not impeaching him, and many of which could be apocalyptic for democracy. And then the second one is that, if they view this as the only viable strategy, what does that say about their tactical and strategic brilliance? Surely there are other things in the arsenal, particularly with a president as bad as Trump, and with it as many, long-run systemic things that he's done to create damage to our democracy and to our country. There should be more than one fundraising tool in the arsenal.
Absolutely. All right, if you're watching this later on YouTube or Facebook, we're gonna have 2 links for you down in the description box you can click on. tyt.com/impeach. Let's go. Okay, and more importantly in this case, Elizabeth Spiers' wonderful article in the New Republic.
Thank you.
So please click on it, check it out. Chock full of actual facts. It's absolutely refreshing to read. And Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us on the Young Turks.
Thank you.